Christoph Eberhard. I'm a researcher and invited professor of anthropology of law and theory of law at the Faculté Universitaire Saint-Louis in Brussels. And I've been working over the last almost like 15 years on questions of law in the intercultural dialogue and globalization in the intercultural dialogue. And one of my research topics, which I try to share here, is the question of human rights in intercultural dialogue, which is a very European question from the outset, and which really brings us to the foundations, I would say, of how Europeans may consider living together and the questions it disposes on a European and the international level. Why? Human rights point to a big ambiguity in a certain way. By focusing on the equality of all human beings, well, they do point to what unites us, to the pole of unity, and at the same time they also point to our diversity, because human beings do express their humanity in very, very, very different ways. And so respecting human rights, thinking about human rights, asks us to, on the one hand, recognize the universalism of the human condition, and at the same time, a relativism of its expressions. So the big question which arises, is it possible to reconcile these two poles? Is it possible to have a pluralist approach? The second question which arises is, when we have this nice idea of human rights, how do we apply it to concrete situations? How do we translate nice principles to grassroots levels? So here we have a second question, which is the one of universalism and particularisms. Now, in the recent years, what has changed in the debates is that we start to talk more and more about globalization and the global-local interface. And so these problematics get reinterpreted also in that framework. Now, for me, it seems very, very important to move towards a dialogical approach to human rights, which I can sum up in, let's say, 3 challenges in one underlying horizon, which are to understand the challenges of alterity, complexity, interculturality with the underlying horizon of humanity. What is alterity about? It's to make a first cultural disarmament, which is to say our human rights tradition, our European tradition, is one tradition amongst others. There are other legal cultures. We're not the only culture existing in the world. So we have to open up to this otherness, which maybe has a more culturalist aspect to it. And we try to see what is the difference if we compare Chinese and the European. What are the main differences in our ways of dealing with this? It's a very important step. But then we must move to a second cultural disarmament, which is to say, okay, now we have understood different cultures, but everything is not only cultural. We have also like political impact, we have historical impacts, we have social conditions. So how do we move to the complex situations where all these cultural aspects and the others interact? And also the societies as such are heterogeneous. So this is a second cultural disarmament in the sense that we disarm the notion of cultures being the only relevant one. We moved towards more dynamic approaches. Alterity was more taking pictures, seeing the differences, and now with complexity we start to see how do things move. Then there's the third challenge, which is the challenge of interculturality, which is a little different from the 2 previous ones, because it is about understanding the other. What we have done in alterity and complexity is trying to understand it, translate it back in our framework, and opening up our window on the world more by doing this. But even if we open our window more, the other windows still exist. So the question is, how are we dealing with this in-between windows? I cannot speak 2 languages at the same time. I can speak English and Chinese, maybe I've learned it, I can speak it at different times, but I cannot speak it at the same time. So even though I may be translating things back in the way of alterity and complexity into my European framework, what about the Chinese who translate it back into their Chinese framework? And how do we deal with this in between the windows, if you want? And how to raise an awareness for this pluralism of windows. And we'll never be able to only have one window, because we need these different structures and the perspective is always limited. So these are the 3 disarmaments, yes? The last one being a more existential one, and which just leads to the underlying horizon, which is the one of a shared humanity. And I think it's very important nowadays, where there is a tendency to move towards more and more technical approaches to everything, and to put faith in the solution of problems through better governance models or procedures and so on, to just take again this view that basically it's human beings who have to take responsibility, and maybe that we should reconnect with the humanist European tradition to form responsible human beings who can act in a, well, more and more complex and intercultural way.